Hey there. I know why you're here. You're looking for a story that will help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Something calming, a little mysterious. Something that carries your mind away. Well, you've come to the right place. Before we begin tonight's journey, do me a little favor. Tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below. Even just a good night. It really helps more sleepy souls like you find their way here. Now, close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let's begin tonight's story. Some sounds become part of your daily routine. The hum of traffic outside your window, the neighbor's dog barking at the mailman, the creak of old floorboards when you walk to the kitchen. But what happens when a sound appears that doesn't belong? What happens when that sound follows a pattern so precise, so deliberate, that coincidence becomes impossible? Tonight, we explore the story of a man who discovered that isolation can manifest in ways we never expect. A man who learned that sometimes the most terrifying calls are the ones we make to ourselves. It started simply enough. 3 knocks. Always 3. Always when the phone rang. Always when someone was on the line. At first, he dismissed it. Old building, settling pipes. The mind playing tricks during lonely evenings. But patterns have a way of demanding attention. And this pattern had been trying to tell him something all along. Because the knocking wasn't random. It wasn't coming from the walls or the ceiling, or the apartment next door. It was coming from somewhere much closer, somewhere that challenged everything he thought he knew about the space between connection and solitude. The calls we answer, the calls we ignore, the calls we make when we're desperate to hear another human voice, and sometimes the calls that come from our own number, carrying our own voice, begging us to listen. This is the story of what happens when the line between loneliness and something far more profound becomes dangerously thin. When the technology meant to connect us becomes a bridge to places we never intended to go. So settle in, turn down the lights, and prepare to discover why some people should never let their phone calls go unanswered. Because tonight, you'll learn that the most haunting conversations are often the ones we have with ourselves. This is The Knocking Only Happens When I'm on the Phone. There's something about the first few months of living alone that nobody warns you about. It's not the obvious things like learning to cook for one person or remembering to lock the door because there's no one else to check it. It's the silence. The way it fills every corner of your home like water, seeping into spaces you didn't even know existed. At first you fight it. You leave the television on constantly, play music while you brush your teeth, call people just to hear another voice cut through the quiet. But eventually you stop fighting. The silence becomes familiar. It becomes yours. He had been living in apartment 4B for exactly 3 months and 12 days when the knocking started, though he wouldn't realize the significance of that timing until much later. The divorce papers had been signed on a Tuesday in July, and by Friday he was carrying boxes up 3 flights of stairs in a building that smelled like decades of other people's cooking and disappointment. The apartment wasn't much. A 1-bedroom with thin walls and thinner bank account to match, but it was his. The first space in 15 years of marriage that belonged entirely to him. No compromise on paint colors, no discussion about furniture placement, no negotiation over which channel to watch. Just him and the growing familiarity of his own breathing in rooms that echoed slightly when he spoke to himself. The routine had become sacred in the way that routines do when you're rebuilding a life from scratch. Coffee at 6:30, always black now because there was no one to remind him that cream was better for his stomach. Shower at 7, work by 8:15, home by 6:45, if traffic cooperated. Dinner alone at the small table he'd bought from a thrift store, reading news on his phone because the silence while eating was still too much to bear. Television until 10, then bed, where he'd lie awake listening to the building settle around him like an old man easing into a chair. The sounds of the building had become a catalogue he knew by heart. Mrs. Chen above him playing her television too loud. The college students next door coming home at all hours. The mysterious dripping somewhere in the walls that the superintendent had given up trying to find. But on this particular Tuesday evening in October, as the first real cold snap of the season rattled the windows, something new entered his carefully constructed world of predictable sounds. He had just finished reheating leftover Chinese takeout, orange chicken that tasted like regret, and fried rice that had seen better days when his phone rang. The sound cut through the apartment like a knife through fabric, sharp and demanding. He almost didn't answer. Work had been calling more frequently lately, asking him to take on projects that required evening hours, and he'd been avoiding the additional responsibility. The last thing he wanted was to spend his Tuesday night reviewing quarterly reports or debugging code that someone else should have caught during business hours. The phone rang again, the generic tone he'd never bothered to change echoing off the walls. He glanced at the screen, unknown number. Probably a scam call, he thought, but something made him reach for it anyway. Maybe it was the way the silence seemed to lean in, waiting for his decision. Maybe it was the recognition that this phone call, like all phone calls in his new life, represented a moment of connection with the world beyond these walls. Even a robocall selling him extended car warranties was proof that somewhere, somehow, people still remembered his existence. He swiped to answer on the fourth ring, just before it would have gone to voicemail, and pressed the phone to his ear with the resignation of someone who had grown tired of avoiding human contact, even the artificial kind. "Hello?" he said into the phone, his voice carrying that particular tone of cautious greeting reserved for unknown numbers. There was no immediate response, just the faint hiss of an open line and what might have been breathing, though it could just as easily have been the sound of bad connection or automated equipment cycling through its programmed responses. He waited, counting the seconds in his head the way he'd learned to do during particularly awkward work meetings. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. Still, nothing. He was about to hang up when he heard it for the first time. 3 knocks, deliberate, evenly spaced, coming from somewhere inside the apartment. Not the random banging of pipes or the settling of old wood, but purposeful strikes against what sounded like a door or wall. Knock, pause, knock, pause, knock. Each one clear and distinct, resonating through the rooms with an authority that made him look up from his phone and scan the living room as if the source might suddenly reveal itself. The knocks seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, the way sound travels through walls and floors in older buildings, distorted and amplified, until its origin becomes impossible to pinpoint. He pulled the phone away from his ear and looked at the screen. The call was still connected, the timer showing 23 seconds and counting. When he pressed the phone back to his ear, the line was dead. No dial tone, no automated message, just the flat silence that follows a disconnected call. He hung up and stood in the middle of his living room, listening. The building's familiar soundtrack resumed. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant murmur of someone's television, the occasional creak of floorboards from the apartment above. But those 3 knocks had been different. They had been immediate, present, and utterly out of place in his catalogue of expected sounds. Walking through the apartment, felt like conducting an investigation he wasn't qualified to perform. He started with the front door, checking the locks and peering through the peephole into the dimly lit hallway. Empty, as always. The elderly woman across the hall kept irregular hours, but her door remained closed, no light visible beneath it. He moved methodically through each room. The kitchen with its ancient appliances and persistent drip from the faucet. The bedroom with its single window overlooking the building's small courtyard. The bathroom where the mirror still fogged slightly from his morning shower. Nothing seemed disturbed, nothing seemed different, yet the space felt changed somehow, as if those 3 knocks had shifted something fundamental about the apartment's relationship with silence. The logical part of his mind, the part that had been trained through years of troubleshooting technical problems at work, began generating explanations. Old buildings made noise, especially when the temperature dropped suddenly. Pipes expanded and contracted, wooden beams settled, and sound traveled in unexpected ways through walls and floors. The timing was coincidental. He had answered a wrong number or automated system glitch at the same moment that the building decided to announce its age with a few strategic creaks. But even as he ran through these rational explanations, something deeper insisted that the timing had been too perfect, the knocks too deliberate, the silence afterward too complete. It was as if the apartment had been waiting for that phone call, waiting for the moment when he was connected to someone else, to make itself known in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Sleep came reluctantly that night, the way it often did since the divorce, arriving in fits and starts between stretches of staring at the ceiling and listening to the building breathe around him. When he finally drifted off sometime after midnight, his dreams were filled with the sound of ringing phones that no one answered and doors that opened onto empty hallways where his own voice echoed back from somewhere he couldn't see. He woke Wednesday morning with the gritty feeling of insufficient rest and the nagging sense that something important had happened the night before. Though in the harsh light of morning, 3 mysterious knocks seemed less significant than they had in the evening's quiet. Work provided its usual distraction, emails that demanded immediate attention, meetings that could have been handled with a simple phone call, and the constant background hum of office life that made his apartment's silence seem almost luxurious by comparison. He found himself thinking about the incident less as the day progressed, filing it away in the mental folder reserved for minor mysteries that would likely resolve themselves with time and rational thought. By lunch, he had convinced himself that his initial assessment had been correct. Old building, changing weather, coincidental timing. The mind, he reminded himself, was remarkably good at creating patterns where none existed, especially when that mind belonged to someone who spent too much time alone with his thoughts. But when his phone rang at 3:47 that afternoon, displaying his mother's number on the screen, the memory of the previous evening's knocks rushed back with unexpected intensity. He hesitated before answering, his finger hovering over the green button while he listened to his office surroundings, the steady click of keyboards, the murmur of a conference call from the cubicle next to his, the reassuring normalcy of a Wednesday afternoon in corporate America. This was different from the previous night's unknown caller in his quiet apartment. This was his mother calling from her house in Ohio, probably to check on him or share some piece of neighborhood gossip. There was nothing mysterious or threatening about it, nothing that should cause the slight acceleration of his heartbeat or the sudden awareness of the silence between rings. He answered on the 4th ring, as had become his habit. "Hi, Mom." The voice filled his ear with its familiar warmth, immediately launching into an update about his father's ongoing battle with the landscaping company over the placement of their new sprinkler system. It was the kind of mundane domestic drama that had once seemed trivial but now felt precious in its ordinariness, a reminder that life continued in patterns both small and predictable beyond the walls of his temporary existence. She talked about the neighbors, about the weather, about whether he was eating enough vegetables and getting sufficient sleep. Normal maternal concerns delivered with the practiced ease of someone who had been worrying about her children for over 40 years. 20 minutes into the conversation, as his mother was describing her plans for Thanksgiving dinner and wondering whether he would be able to make the drive to Ohio, he heard them again. 3 knocks, identical to the night before in timing and tone, coming from somewhere in the office around him. But this time he was surrounded by 40 other people, none of whom seemed to notice the sound that had just interrupted his mother's discussion of whether to serve sweet potato casserole or regular mashed potatoes. He looked around the office, expecting to see someone knocking on a door or tapping on a desk, but everyone continued their afternoon routines, typing, talking, drinking coffee from paper cups that bore the company logo. The knocks had been clear and immediate, just as they had been in his apartment, but apparently audible only to him. "Did you hear that?" he asked his mother, interrupting her mid-sentence analysis of his Aunt Linda's contribution to family gatherings. The question slipped out before he could stop himself, driven by a sudden desperate need for confirmation that he wasn't losing his grip on reality in some fundamental way. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that occurs when someone is genuinely confused by a question that seems to have no context. "Hear what, honey?" his mother asked, her voice carrying that note of gentle concern that had been present in all their conversations since the divorce papers were signed. "Are you all right? You sound distracted." This was the tone she used when she suspected he wasn't taking care of himself properly. The same voice that had asked about his eating habits and sleep schedule earlier in the conversation. He could picture her in her kitchen, probably organizing something while they talked, her face wearing the expression of maternal worry that had become more pronounced since his life had fallen apart in such a public and definitive way. He looked around the office again, searching for any sign that someone else had heard the knocks or was engaged in some activity that might have produced the sound. Nothing. The woman in the cubicle across from him was eating a salad while reviewing spreadsheets. The man behind him was on his own phone call, discussing what sounded like a client presentation scheduled for Friday. Everyone continued their Wednesday afternoon existence, oblivious to the impossible sound that had just shattered his growing sense that the previous night had been an isolated incident. The knocks had followed him from his apartment to his office, from his private space to his public one, maintaining their precise timing and their apparent invisibility to everyone except him. "No, Mom, I'm fine," he said, though the words felt like a lie even as he spoke them. "I thought I heard. Never mind. Tell me more about Thanksgiving." It was easier to deflect than to explain something he didn't understand himself. Easier to let his mother return to her comfortable discussion of family logistics than to admit that his carefully rebuilt world was developing cracks that let in sounds from somewhere he couldn't identify. She resumed her planning, apparently satisfied that whatever had distracted him was not worth pursuing, but he found it increasingly difficult to follow her words as his mind raced through possible explanations for what was happening. The rest of the workday passed in a haze of distracted productivity and growing unease. Every phone call, and there were several, as Wednesday afternoon brought its usual collection of client questions and internal coordination, carried the potential for those 3 knocks. They didn't come again, but their absence felt almost more unsettling than their presence would have been. He found himself listening for them, waiting through conversations with colleagues and vendors for the sound that would confirm he was either losing his mind or experiencing something that existed beyond the boundaries of normal experience. Neither option offered much comfort. By the time he reached his apartment that evening, the weight of the day's events had settled into a familiar knot of anxiety in his chest, the same feeling that had accompanied him through the worst days of the divorce proceedings, when reality seemed to shift beneath his feet without warning. He stood in his living room, looking at the phone in his hand and wondering if the knocks were somehow connected to the device itself, some kind of electromagnetic interference or software glitch that manifested as auditory hallucinations. But that theory crumbled under the basic logic that his mother, calling from Ohio on a completely different phone system, should not be able to trigger the same phenomenon that had occurred with an unknown caller the night before. Whatever was happening, it was becoming clear that it followed rules he didn't yet understand, patterns that connected his conversations with the outside world to sounds that seemed to come from within his own space. The apartment felt different now, charged with the possibility that at any moment his phone might ring and bring with it those 3 deliberate knocks that belonged neither to his building's familiar soundtrack, nor to the rational world he was trying so desperately to inhabit. Thursday morning arrived with a kind of grey October sky that seemed to press down on the city like a weighted blanket. He woke before his alarm, as had become his habit since the knocking began, his body apparently deciding that sleep was a luxury he could no longer afford in full measure. The apartment felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, charged with a tension that hadn't existed just 3 days earlier. Every shadow seemed purposeful. Every creak of the building's aging bones carried potential significance. He lay in bed for 20 minutes, listening to the familiar sounds that had once been comforting in their predictability. The radiator's morning protests, the footsteps of early commuters in the hallway, the distant hum of traffic beginning its daily crescendo. But underneath it all, he found himself waiting for something else. Something that logic told him wouldn't come unless his phone rang. The coffee maker gurgled to life with its usual mechanical enthusiasm, filling the kitchen with the aroma that had become his most reliable morning comfort. But even this simple ritual felt different now, tinged with an awareness that his apartment was no longer just his own private space, but potentially something more complex, something that responded to external connections in ways he was only beginning to understand. He found himself glancing at his phone more frequently than usual, noting each notification, each potential call that might trigger whatever force was responsible for those 3 deliberate knocks. The device sat silent on the counter, its black screen reflecting the kitchen's fluorescent lighting, like a dark mirror that might reveal something he wasn't prepared to see. Work emails had accumulated overnight, the usual collection of project updates and meeting requests that marked the rhythm of corporate life. But reading them felt like performing a role in a play whose script had been secretly rewritten. He responded to each message with his usual professional efficiency, scheduling meetings and confirming deadlines, all while part of his mind remained focused on the possibility that at any moment his phone might ring and bring with it confirmation that Tuesday night's experience was not an isolated incident. The rational part of his consciousness insisted that he was creating connections where none existed, that stress and isolation were manifesting as auditory hallucinations triggered by the most mundane of daily activities. But rationality felt like a thin shield against the growing certainty that something fundamental had changed in the space between his private world and his connections to everyone else. The commute to work passed in a haze of hypervigilance, every car horn and construction noise causing him to look around for sources that might explain away future mysterious sounds. The subway's familiar cacophony, the screech of brakes, the garbled public address announcements, The hundreds of individual conversations creating a wall of white noise seemed almost aggressive in its normality. These were sounds with clear sources, logical explanations, predictable patterns. They belonged to a world where cause and effect operated according to rules he understood, where mystery was something that happened to other people in movies and books, not to middle-aged men trying to rebuild their lives in studio apartments with thin walls and questionable plumbing. But even surrounded by the city's reliable chaos, he found himself thinking about the perfect timing of those knocks, the way they had arrived at the exact moment when he was connected to another human voice, as if the apartment had been listening to his conversations and waiting for the right moment to announce its presence. The timing was too precise to be coincidental, too deliberate to be explained by the random settling of an old building. Something was happening that existed outside his understanding of how the world operated, something that connected his phone calls to sounds that seemed to come from within his own space. The train lurched to a stop at his station, and he joined the flow of commuters emerging into the morning light, carrying with him the weight of questions that had no comfortable answers. The day progressed with agonizing normalcy, each hour marked by routine tasks and familiar interactions that felt increasingly surreal against the backdrop of his growing anticipation. He attended a staff meeting about quarterly projections, reviewed code submissions from junior developers, and participated in a conference call about client requirements, all while part of his attention remained focused on his phone and the possibility that it might ring at any moment. His colleagues seemed to exist in a different reality, one where phones were simply communication devices and apartments were just places to live, not potential conduits for experiences that challenged the basic assumptions of daily existence. He envied their unconscious certainty that the world operated according to predictable rules. Lunch arrived without incident, a sandwich eaten at his desk, while reviewing technical documentation that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the attention he could give it. The words swam on the page, technical specifications and implementation details blurring together, as his mind insisted on returning to the question of whether the knocks would come again, and if so, when and why. He had never been particularly superstitious, had always prided himself on his logical approach to problem solving, his ability to break down complex issues into manageable components that could be addressed systematically. But this situation resisted analysis, existed outside the framework of cause and effect that had guided his professional and personal decisions for over 4 decades. The afternoon stretched ahead, like an obstacle course designed to test his patience and sanity. Every email notification caused his heart rate to spike slightly. Every colleague's phone call reminded him of his own device's potential to connect him not just to other people, but apparently to whatever force was responsible for those impossible sounds. He found himself checking the time obsessively, noting that it was exactly 24 hours since his mother had called the previous day, though he couldn't explain why this timing seemed significant. Perhaps patterns were all he had left to hold on to, some way of imposing order on an experience that threatened to dissolve the comfortable boundaries between the explainable and the impossible. At 3:52 p.m., 5 minutes later than the previous day's call, his phone rang. His mother's name appeared on the screen with its familiar photo, a picture from last Christmas, when the family had still been whole, when his biggest concern had been whether to buy his ex-wife the jewelry she'd been hinting about for months. Now that photo seemed like evidence from another lifetime, proof that he had once been someone who worried about normal things like gift-giving and holiday schedules, rather than mysterious sounds that accompanied phone conversations. He let it ring once, twice, his finger hovering over the answer button, while his office continued its afternoon routine around him, oblivious to the small drama of decision playing out at his desk. He answered on the third ring, a day earlier than his usual pattern, driven by a combination of curiosity and dread that made waiting any longer feel impossible. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice carrying more tension than he intended. She launched immediately into an update about his father's latest project, something involving the garage organization and a dispute with the neighborhood association about storage shed regulations. It was exactly the kind of domestic minutiae that had once seemed tedious, but now felt precious in its absolute normality. A reminder that somewhere in Ohio, life continued to unfold according to patterns that made sense, where the biggest mysteries involved municipal regulations and the proper way to store seasonal decorations. His mother's voice filled his ear with its familiar warmth, carrying news from a world where problems had solutions and mysteries were limited to things like why the neighbor's dog kept digging holes in their shared property line. She talked about the upcoming election, about whether they should invest in new storm windows before winter, about his cousin's engagement, and the complicated logistics of planning a wedding during a busy season for the family business. Normal concerns delivered with the practiced ease of someone whose biggest worries involved scheduling conflicts and budget considerations, rather than the possibility that her son might be losing his grip on reality in ways that defied rational explanation. 23 minutes into the conversation, as she was transitioning from wedding planning to her concerns about his father's cholesterol levels and whether the new medication was working as effectively as the doctor had promised, he heard them again. 3 knocks, identical in timing and timbre to the previous occurrences, but this time he was ready. This time he was listening not just to the knocks themselves, but to everything that surrounded them, the quality of silence that preceded them, the way they seemed to resonate through the office space, the complete lack of reaction from his colleagues, who continued their afternoon routines as if nothing unusual had occurred. "Mom, hold on just a second," he said, his voice tight with controlled excitement and barely contained anxiety. He covered the phone's microphone with his hand and looked around the office, searching for any sign that someone else had heard what he'd just experienced. The woman across from him continued typing, her fingers moving across the keyboard in a steady rhythm that suggested deep concentration on whatever spreadsheet commanded her attention. The man behind him was laughing quietly at something on his computer screen, probably a video or social media post that provided a momentary distraction from the afternoon's work. No one showed any sign of having heard 3 deliberate knocks that had been, to his ears, impossible to ignore. "Are you there, honey?" His mother's voice came through the phone, slightly muffled by his hand, but audible enough to remind him that she was waiting for his attention, probably wondering why he had suddenly interrupted their conversation to conduct some kind of silent survey of his workplace. He removed his hand from the microphone and returned the phone to his ear, his heart beating faster than seemed reasonable for someone sitting at a desk in a climate-controlled office building, surrounded by the most mundane aspects of corporate life. "Yeah, Mom, I'm here. Sorry, I thought I heard something." The words felt inadequate to describe what he'd just experienced, but explaining the truth that he was hearing sounds that seemed to coincide perfectly with phone calls, sounds that apparently only he could perceive, would require a conversation he wasn't prepared to have with anyone, least of all his mother, who already worried about his adjustment to single life, and would probably interpret mysterious knocking sounds as evidence that he needed professional help, or at least a visit home to Ohio, where she could monitor his mental state more closely. She accepted his explanation with the kind of maternal grace that had characterized their relationship for 43 years, asking if he was feeling all right and reminding him that stress could manifest in unexpected ways, that the human body and mind were remarkably creative in their methods of expressing the accumulated pressures of major life changes. Her concern was genuine and well-intentioned, but it also highlighted the impossible position he found himself in, unable to share what he was experiencing because it sounded like the beginning of a mental health crisis, yet increasingly certain that something real and external was happening, something that connected his conversations with the outside world to phenomena that existed just beyond the edge of normal experience. The remainder of the call passed without incident, his mother's voice providing a steady stream of familial updates and gentle advice that felt like a lifeline to a world where problems had identifiable causes and reasonable solutions. But underneath his participation in their conversation, part of his mind remained focused on the timing of those knocks, the way they had arrived exactly as they had the day before, triggered by his connection to another person's voice, but audible only to him. The pattern was becoming undeniable, yet it resisted every attempt at logical analysis. How could a sound be triggered by a phone call yet remain localized to his immediate environment? How could something be both completely real to his senses and completely imperceptible to everyone around him? After his mother hung up, promising to call again soon and reminding him to eat more vegetables and get adequate sleep, he sat at his desk staring at his phone as if it might reveal some hidden feature that explained what was happening to him. The device looked exactly as it always had. Black screen, familiar case, the small crack near the corner that had resulted from being dropped on his kitchen floor 3 weeks after moving into the apartment. Nothing about it suggested any connection to mysterious sounds or supernatural phenomena. It was simply a phone, a piece of technology designed to connect human voices across distances, not to serve as some kind of conduit for experiences that challenged the basic assumptions of reality. The rest of the workday dragged with the peculiar weight that accompanies anticipation without resolution. Every email, every meeting, every casual conversation with colleagues felt like a performance he was giving while his real attention remained focused on questions that had no answers. He found himself studying his co-workers' faces, wondering if any of them had ever experienced anything similar, if there was some club of people who heard impossible sounds during phone calls but had learned to keep their experiences private, to avoid the concerned looks and gentle suggestions about stress management or professional counseling that would inevitably follow any admission of such perceptions. The commute home felt like traveling between two different worlds, the public world of work and normalcy, where phones rang according to predictable patterns and sounds had identifiable sources, and the private world of his apartment, where the rules seemed to be different, where his connections to other people could trigger phenomena that existed outside the boundaries of shared experience. The subway's familiar noise seemed almost comforting in its absolute normalcy, a reminder that most of life still operated according to rules he understood, even if his own existence was developing complications that defied rational explanation. By the time he reached his building, climbing the 3 flights of stairs to apartment 4B, the weight of the day's experiences had settled into a familiar knot of anxiety and anticipation in his chest. The hallway seemed longer than usual, the fluorescent lighting more harsh, the sounds from other apartments more intrusive. Mrs. Chen's television was louder than normal. The college students next door were playing music that thumped through the thin walls, and somewhere in the building's infrastructure, that mysterious drip continued its irregular rhythm. But all of these sounds, annoying as they might be, belonged to the world he understood. the world where noise had sources and explanations and could be addressed through normal means like polite conversations with neighbors or calls to building management. His apartment greeted him with its now familiar silence, but the quality of that silence had changed since Tuesday night. Where once it had been simply the absence of sound, the natural quiet of a space occupied by one person living carefully within his own boundaries, it now felt charged with potential, as if the rooms themselves were waiting for something to happen. He set his phone on the kitchen counter and stared at it, wondering if the knocks were somehow contained within the device itself, some kind of technical malfunction that manifested as auditory phenomena only he could perceive. But that theory collapsed under the basic logic that the same sounds had occurred in two different locations, triggered by calls from different numbers, heard through the same phone but manifesting in whatever space he happened to occupy at the time. Whatever was happening, it seemed to be connected not to the phone itself, but to his act of using it, to the moment when his voice joined with someone else's across the electronic bridge that connected his isolation to the larger world of human contact. Friday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that sometimes follows sleepless nights, when exhaustion strips away the comfortable illusions that usually buffer us from difficult truths. He had spent the previous evening sitting in his living room chair, staring at his phone and running through every possible explanation for what was happening to him, from technical malfunctions to stress-induced hallucinations to possibilities that lived in territories his rational mind refused to explore. By 3 in the morning, when sleep finally claimed him for a few restless hours, he had reached a decision that felt both logical and deeply unsettling. If the knocks only came during phone calls, then the solution was simple: stop answering the phone. The plan seemed reasonable in the grey light of dawn, a straightforward application of cause and effect that would either solve the problem or prove that his experiences had some other source entirely. If avoiding phone calls eliminated the knocks, then he would have confirmation that the phenomenon was somehow connected to his conversations with other people. If the sounds continued even without phone calls, then he would know that whatever was happening had deeper roots, sources that existed independently of his attempts to maintain contact with the world beyond his apartment walls. Either way, he would gain information, and information felt like the only weapon he had against an experience that seemed designed to undermine his understanding of how reality operated. But as he prepared for work, going through the familiar motions of shower and coffee and checking email, the implications of his decision began to weigh on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. His phone wasn't just a device that occasionally produced mysterious sounds. It was his primary connection to everything and everyone that existed outside the increasingly narrow boundaries of his daily routine. Work colleagues who needed answers to urgent questions, his mother who called to check on his well-being, his ex-wife who still contacted him occasionally about paperwork and logistics that remained tangled even months after their divorce was finalized. Cutting off phone communication meant cutting off these threads that, however thin and sometimes painful, still connected him to the larger tapestry of human interaction. The commute to work felt different, knowing that his phone would remain silent by choice rather than chance, that he was deliberately severing connections rather than simply waiting for them to occur. The subway's usual cacophony of conversations and electronic notifications from other passengers' devices seemed to mock his decision, surrounding him with evidence of normal human communication while he sat isolated by his own fear of 3 simple knocks that only he could hear. He watched other commuters answer calls, send texts, scroll through social media with the unconscious ease of people who had never questioned whether their devices might serve as conduits for experiences that existed outside the boundaries of normal reality. At his desk, he turned his phone to silent mode and placed it in his desk drawer, physically removing it from his immediate environment as if its mere presence might somehow trigger the phenomena he was trying to avoid. The action felt both protective and pathetic, like a grown man hiding from shadows that might not even exist. But the relief was immediate and tangible. For the first time in 3 days, he could focus on his work without the constant low-level anxiety of wondering when his phone might ring and what sounds might accompany the next attempt at human connection. The spreadsheets and code reviews that had seemed impossibly difficult to concentrate on suddenly became manageable, normal problems with normal solutions that existed firmly within his professional expertise. The first few hours of deliberate disconnection passed with surprising ease, creating a bubble of artificial normalcy that reminded him of what his life had been like before. Tuesday evening's phone call from an unknown number. Email provided a buffer that allowed him to communicate with colleagues and clients without the immediate intimacy of voice contact, reducing human interaction to text on a screen that carried no risk of triggering whatever force was responsible for those impossible sounds. He responded to project updates, scheduled meetings, and resolved technical issues with an efficiency that had been missing from his work since the knocking began, his mind finally free to focus entirely on problems that had logical solutions and predictable outcomes. But as the morning progressed, the silence began to accumulate weight in ways he hadn't expected. His desk phone, which he had also been avoiding, blinked with missed call notifications that represented questions he wasn't answering, colleagues who needed immediate responses, clients who expected accessibility as part of the professional services they were paying for. Each missed call was a small betrayal of the relationships and responsibilities that defined his working life, tiny acts of disconnection that added up to something that felt dangerously close to professional negligence. He found himself checking the caller ID obsessively, trying to determine which calls were truly urgent and which could be delayed or handled through email, but every number on the display represented a human being who had expected to reach him and found only silence. The weight of missed connections extended beyond work into the personal realm that had already been diminished by divorce and the gradual erosion of friendships that came with major life changes. His mother had probably tried to call, continuing her pattern of daily check-ins that had become more frequent since his life had imploded in such a public and definitive way. His brother might have called about their father's upcoming birthday, expecting coordination about gifts and plans that required real-time conversation rather than the delayed exchanges that email allowed. Even his ex-wife might have tried to reach him about some detail of their continuing disentanglement, one of the hundreds of small practical matters that kept them connected even after love and compatibility had failed. By lunch, the isolation had become its own presence in his life, a weight that sat in his chest like accumulated guilt over relationships he was neglecting out of fear of sounds that might not even be real. He ate a sandwich at his desk while staring at his phone, which remained silent in his drawer like evidence of his own cowardice, his inability to face whatever was happening to him with the kind of courage that the situation seemed to require. The rational part of his mind insisted that he was being prudent, gathering information through systematic experimentation, but another part recognized that he was simply running away from an experience that challenged his understanding of reality in ways that felt too large and frightening to confront directly. The afternoon stretched ahead with the peculiar emptiness that comes from deliberate disconnection, each hour marked by the absence of communication rather than its presence. He completed projects with mechanical efficiency, attended meetings where he participated only through physical presence, while his mind remained focused on what he was avoiding rather than what he was accomplishing. Colleagues began to comment on his unusual quietness, his reluctance to engage in the casual conversations that normally punctuated the workday, but he deflected their concerns with vague references to concentration and deadlines, unwilling to explain that he was conducting an experiment in isolation as a defense against phenomena that existed outside their shared understanding of normal experience. The commute home carried a different quality of tension than the morning's journey, weighted with the accumulated guilt of a day spent avoiding the very connections that gave meaning to daily existence. His phone, restored to normal mode after 8 hours of deliberate silence, immediately began buzzing with notifications that represented the human cost of his experiment. 7 missed calls from his mother, 3 from work colleagues, 2 from numbers he didn't recognize, and 1 from his ex-wife that probably involved some urgent matter related to their ongoing divorce logistics. Each notification was evidence of someone who had tried to reach him and found only the electronic substitute of voicemail, a poor replacement for the immediate warmth of human voice that had been the original purpose of telephone technology. Standing on the subway platform, surrounded by commuters who talked freely on their phones without fear of mysterious consequences, he felt the full weight of what his avoidance strategy was costing him. The woman next to him was laughing at something her friend was telling her, the kind of spontaneous joy that comes from shared connection across distance. A businessman near the track was coordinating dinner plans with what sounded like his family, the comfortable intimacy of domestic logistics that represented everything he had lost in the divorce and was now voluntarily abandoning out of fear. These normal human interactions, which he had once taken for granted, now seemed like acts of courage that he was no longer capable of performing. The train ride home became a catalogue of all the ways he was failing to maintain the relationships that remained in his life, all the small daily acts of connection that he was abandoning in favor of a silence that protected him from mysterious sounds, but isolated him from everything that made existence meaningful. His mother's 7 calls probably represented escalating concern about his well-being, a progression from casual check-in to genuine worry that might culminate in her calling his work, or even making the drive from Ohio to check on him in person. The missed work calls could be urgent projects or client emergencies that his silence was making worse, professional problems that were accumulating interest like unpaid debts, while he hid from 3 knocks that might be nothing more than the product of stress and isolation. His apartment building seemed more imposing than usual, its 3 flights of stairs feeling like a climb toward isolation, rather than the simple return to a private space that had once provided comfort and security. The hallway's fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows that made familiar doorways look threatening, and the sounds from other apartments, Mrs. Chen's television, the college students' music, the building's mechanical system seemed to emphasize his own silence, his deliberate disconnection from the network of human contact that most residents maintained without questioning its safety or consequences. Inside apartment 4B, the silence felt different than it had in the morning, where once it had been protective, a barrier against experiences he wasn't ready to confront. It now felt accusatory, heavy with the weight of conversations he had avoided and connections he had severed out of fear. The phone sat on his kitchen counter like evidence of his own failure, its dark screen reflecting his image back at him in fragments that seemed appropriate for someone whose life was increasingly defined by avoidance rather than engagement. The missed call notifications continued to accumulate, each buzz a reminder that somewhere in the world people were trying to reach him. trying to maintain the threads of connection that he was systematically cutting in order to avoid three sounds that he couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. The evening passed in a strange suspension between relief and regret, the comfort of silence battling against the accumulated weight of missed connections and neglected relationships. He heated leftover pasta while staring at his phone, which had finally stopped buzzing with new notifications, but carried the digital weight of all the calls he had avoided throughout the day. The voicemail icon showed 12 messages waiting for his attention, each one representing someone who had expected to reach him and found only the electronic simulation of his voice, explaining that he was unavailable and would return calls as soon as possible. But as soon as possible had become never in his new reality, where the simple act of answering the phone carried risks he was no longer willing to take. His mother's messages, when he finally forced himself to listen to them, chronicled a day-long journey from casual concern to mounting worry to something approaching panic. The first call, at 9:23 a.m., had been her usual cheerful check-in about his day and whether he was remembering to eat breakfast. By the third call, at 1:47 p.m., her tone had shifted to puzzlement about why he wasn't answering. The seventh and final call, at 6:15 p.m., carried the kind of maternal worry that threatened to manifest as decisive action. She was considering calling his work to check on his well-being, or possibly even making the drive from Ohio to verify that he was still alive and functional. The progression of concern in her voice was a painful reminder of how his isolation affected not just himself, but everyone who cared about his continued existence. The work messages were equally troubling, representing projects that had stalled without his input, client questions that remained unanswered, and the beginning of professional consequences that could threaten the job that provided his only source of income and sense of purpose. His supervisor had called twice, the second message carrying a note of irritation about his unexpected unavailability during a day when several urgent matters required immediate attention. Colleagues had called seeking technical guidance that only he could provide, their voices growing increasingly frustrated as the day progressed without response. The missed work calls weren't just professional inconveniences, they were evidence that his fear of mysterious sounds was beginning to damage the career he had worked decades to build. But the most unsettling message came from his ex-wife, her familiar voice carrying the particular tone of controlled anger that he remembered from the worst days of their marriage. She had called about papers that needed his signature for their final tax filing, documents that were time-sensitive and required coordination that couldn't be handled through email or delayed indefinitely, while he worked through whatever personal crisis was making him impossible to reach. Her message ended with an observation that felt like a knife to his already wounded sense of self. I know the divorce was hard, but disappearing from the world isn't going to solve anything. People are starting to worry about you, and frankly so am I. As the evening deepened into night, the weight of his self-imposed isolation became unbearable in ways that made the mysterious knocks seem like a trivial concern compared to the real and immediate damage he was doing to his relationships and responsibilities. The knocks, whatever their source or meaning, lasted only seconds and affected only him, but his avoidance of them was creating consequences that rippled outward into every area of his life, damaging professional relationships, worrying family members, and reinforcing the isolation that had already been threatening to consume him since the divorce. He sat in his living room chair, holding his phone, and realizing that he had reached a choice point that would define not just his response to the mysterious sounds, but his willingness to remain connected to the world of human relationships that gave life meaning and purpose. At 9:47 p.m., as he sat staring at his phone and contemplating the impossible choice between mysterious fear and meaningful isolation. The device rang. The caller ID showed his mother's number, probably her final attempt to reach him before taking more dramatic action to verify his continued existence. He looked at the screen for 4 rings, his finger hovering over the answer button, while his apartment held its breath around him, waiting to see whether he would choose connection despite its mysterious risks, or continue the isolation that was slowly destroying everything he had left. The ringing continued, insistent and demanding, carrying with it not just his mother's voice, but his last chance to remain part of the world that existed beyond the walls of apartment 4B, where silence had become both protection and prison, where the fear of 3 simple knocks was threatening to cost him everything that made existence bearable. The phone continued its insistent ringing, each tone cutting through the apartment's silence like a blade through fabric, demanding a decision that would determine not just the next few minutes, but potentially the entire trajectory of his remaining connections to the world beyond these walls. His mother's name on the display carried with it 43 years of shared history, countless conversations that had ranged from childhood's scraped knees to adult heartbreaks, from celebration of achievements to comfort during failures. She had been the voice that congratulated him when he got his first job, the ear that listened when his marriage began to crumble, the presence that remained constant even as everything else in his life shifted and changed in ways he couldn't control or predict. The weight of her 7 previous attempts to reach him pressed against his consciousness like accumulated debt, each missed call representing not just a failed connection, but a small betrayal of the relationship that had been his most reliable source of unconditional love and support. He could picture her in her kitchen in Ohio, probably pacing the way she did when she was worried, running through increasingly dramatic scenarios to explain his sudden unavailability. Was he sick? Had there been an accident? Was his isolation after the divorce becoming something more serious? A slide into depression, or worse, that required immediate intervention. The progression of concern in her earlier messages suggested that she was already moving beyond worry toward action, and action meant consequences that would extend far beyond his carefully controlled environment. On the 6th ring, just before the call would transfer to voicemail and add another message to the collection of avoided conversations, he made the choice that felt both inevitable and terrifying. His finger moved across the screen with deliberate intention, accepting the connection that would either prove his fears were justified or demonstrate that he had been running from shadows that existed only in his own exhausted and isolated mind. The moment between touching the screen and hearing his mother's voice felt suspended in time, charged with potential outcomes that ranged from relief to confirmation of his worst suspicions about what was happening in his apartment. "Hello?" he said, his voice carrying more tension than any greeting should contain, the single word freighted with days of accumulated anxiety and the knowledge that whatever happened next would either restore his sense of normalcy or confirm that his reality had fundamentally changed in ways he couldn't explain or control. There was a pause on the other end, the brief moment of surprise that often follows answered prayers, when the thing you've been hoping for finally occurs but carries with it the shock of actually having worked. "Oh, thank God," his mother's voice flooded through the phone, relief and worry competing for dominance in her tone. "I've been trying to reach you all day. I was starting to think something terrible had happened." Her words carried the particular weight of maternal concern that had been sharpened by his recent divorce, and her awareness that he was navigating the challenges of rebuilding his life without the support systems that had sustained him for over a decade. She had been watching him struggle with isolation and depression, offering what help she could from a distance while respecting his need for independence. but his sudden unavailability had clearly pushed her beyond the boundaries of patient concern into the territory of active worry that demanded resolution. "I'm fine, Mom," he said, though the words felt like a lie even as he spoke them, a reflexive response designed to provide reassurance rather than accuracy. "I'm sorry I missed your calls. Work has been complicated." The excuse was partially true. Work had indeed been affected by his deliberate disconnection, but it failed to capture the reality of his situation, the way fear of three simple sounds had driven him to avoid one of the most basic forms of human connection. He found himself listening not just to her words, but to the quality of silence around him, hyper-aware of every sound in the apartment, waiting for the knocks that had become the focal point of his daily anxiety. She launched into the conversation with the enthusiasm of someone who had been storing up observations and concerns throughout a day of failed attempts at connection, sharing details about his father's ongoing battle with the landscape contractor, updates about neighbors and their various domestic dramas, and questions about his own well-being that probed gently but persistently for signs that he was managing the transition to single life better than she feared. Her voice carried the familiar rhythms of maternal care, the way she had always used conversation as a vehicle for checking on his physical and emotional state, without making the monitoring feel intrusive or overwhelming. 15 minutes into the call, as she was describing the complications involved in planning his cousin's wedding, while accommodating various family members' scheduling conflicts and dietary restrictions, he found himself relaxing in ways he hadn't experienced since Tuesday evening's first mysterious phone call. This was normal, exactly the kind of ordinary family conversation that had been part of his life for decades, comfortable in its predictability and reassuring in its evidence that some relationships could withstand the upheavals and changes that had characterized recent months. Perhaps his fears had been exaggerated, products of stress and isolation, rather than genuine supernatural phenomena that required dramatic changes to his daily routine. The knocks came at exactly 18 minutes and 37 seconds into the conversation, precisely as his mother was transitioning from wedding logistics to her concerns about whether he was eating properly and getting enough sleep. 3 deliberate strikes against what sounded like wood, coming from the direction of his kitchen but somehow seeming to originate from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was exactly as he had experienced it before, clear, purposeful, impossible to ignore. But this time he was prepared. This time he was listening, not just to the knocks themselves, but to everything that surrounded them, trying to capture evidence that might help him understand what was happening to his carefully ordered world. "Did you hear that?" he asked, the question emerging before he could stop himself, driven by the desperate hope that this time, finally, someone else would acknowledge the sounds that had been haunting his phone conversations for nearly a week. The words hung in the air between them, carrying with them not just the immediate question but all of his accumulated anxiety about his own sanity, his growing isolation, and his fear that he was experiencing something that existed outside the boundaries of shared reality. His mother's response would either validate his experiences or confirm his worst fears about his own mental state. "Hear what, honey?" his mother replied, her voice carrying the particular note of gentle concern that he had come to associate with conversations about his adjustment to single life, the tone she used when she suspected he might be struggling with aspects of his new reality that he wasn't ready to discuss openly. There was no recognition of the knocks in her voice, no indication that she had perceived anything unusual during their conversation. From her perspective, he had interrupted her mid-sentence to ask about sounds that didn't exist, behavior that probably seemed consistent with the stress and isolation she had been worrying about since his divorce became final. The confirmation that she hadn't heard the knocks felt like a physical blow, not because he had really expected her to perceive sounds that were somehow localized to his immediate environment, but because her inability to hear them made his experiences feel even more isolated and inexplicable. If the knocks existed only for him, triggered by phone calls but audible to no one else, then what was happening fell into categories of experience that he wasn't equipped to understand or address. Mental health issues seemed like the most logical explanation, but the sounds had been too consistent, too precisely timed, too clearly external to dismiss as simple hallucinations. "Nothing, Mom," he said, trying to inject normalcy into his voice while his mind raced through the implications of what had just occurred. "I thought I heard the neighbors, but it was probably just the building settling." The lie came easily, practiced through days of avoiding conversations about experiences he couldn't explain, but it felt like another small betrayal of the relationship that had been his most reliable source of honesty and support. His mother accepted the explanation with the grace that characterized most of their interactions, returning to her concerns about his diet and sleep schedule, but he could hear the subtle shift in her tone that suggested she was filing away his question as another piece of evidence that he might not be managing his isolation as well as he claimed. The remainder of their conversation passed without incident, but the quality of his attention had changed. Where before he had been listening to her words with the comfortable familiarity of someone engaging in routine family interaction, now part of his mind remained focused on the silence around him, waiting for sounds that might or might not come, hyper-aware of every creak and settling noise that the building produced as part of its normal evening routine. He participated in the conversation with responses that were appropriate and caring, but he felt like he was performing the role of devoted son while his real attention remained focused on phenomena that existed outside the boundaries of normal family discussion. When his mother finally said goodbye, reminding him to call more regularly, and expressing relief that he was safe and well, he hung up with a mixture of gratitude for her continued presence in his life and frustration at his inability to share what was happening to him. The phone call had achieved its purpose of maintaining their relationship and providing her with reassurance about his basic well-being, but it had also confirmed that whatever he was experiencing remained completely isolated to his own perception, phenomena that he couldn't share or verify through normal means of communication and connection. The apartment felt different after the call ended, charged with the presence of confirmed mystery rather than the hopeful possibility that his fears had been exaggerated products of stress and imagination. The knocks had come exactly as they had before, precisely timed to coincide with his connection to another human voice, but completely imperceptible to the person on the other end of the line. This wasn't a technical malfunction or a building maintenance issue or a coincidence that could be explained through rational analysis. This was something else entirely, something that challenged his understanding of reality in ways that demanded either acceptance of impossible possibilities or acknowledgement that his mental state was deteriorating in directions that required professional intervention. He sat in his living room chair after ending the call with his mother, staring at his phone and trying to process what had just occurred. The device looked exactly as it always had. Familiar case, cracked screen, the accumulated wear of daily use, but it now felt like something foreign, a piece of technology that might be capable of functions he had never suspected or considered. The rational part of his mind insisted that phones were simply communication devices, pieces of hardware and software designed to transmit voices across distances according to well-understood principles of electronics and network infrastructure. But his experiences suggested that his phone might be serving as some kind of conduit for phenomena that existed outside the boundaries of conventional technology. The evening stretched ahead, with the peculiar weight that follows confirmed fears. when the hope that problems might resolve themselves through avoidance or wishful thinking gives way to the recognition that something fundamental has changed and requires direct confrontation. He had been hoping that his mother's call would either eliminate the knocks entirely, proving that his fears had been exaggerated, or provide him with a witness who could confirm that the sounds were real and external, rather than products of his own deteriorating mental state. Instead, the call had confirmed the worst possible outcome. The knocks were real enough to be consistently experienced, but apparently existed only within his own perception, isolated from the shared reality that allowed human beings to verify and validate each other's experiences. The implications of this isolation felt overwhelming in ways that went beyond the immediate mystery of the knocks themselves. If he was experiencing auditory phenomena that coincided perfectly with phone calls but remained imperceptible to other people, then either he was developing serious mental health issues that required immediate professional attention, or he was encountering something that existed outside the normal boundaries of human experience. Neither possibility offered comfort, but the mental health explanation at least provided a path forward that involved doctors and medication and treatment options that might restore his sense of normalcy and connection to shared reality. At 11:23 p.m., as he sat contemplating whether to call a mental health crisis line or wait until morning to contact his doctor about what might be early symptoms of a psychological breakdown, his phone rang. The sound cut through his contemplation like an alarm, startling him not just because of the late hour, but because of the number displayed on the screen. The caller ID showed his own phone number, the 10 digits that he had memorized years ago when he first got the line, now appearing as if someone else was using his number to call him. This was impossible, according to every understanding he had of how phone systems worked, a technical impossibility that suggested either a sophisticated prank or a malfunction so fundamental that it challenged the basic principles of telecommunications infrastructure. He stared at the screen through 4 complete rings, his heart rate accelerating as he tried to process what he was seeing. The number was definitely his own. He had checked it against his contact information twice to be certain, but somehow it was calling itself, creating a loop of connection that shouldn't be possible within normal technical parameters. The phone continued ringing with its familiar tone, but now that sound carried implications that went far beyond simple communication between 2 people. This was something else entirely, a phenomenon that existed outside his understanding of how reality operated, demanding a choice between answering a call that couldn't exist or letting it go to voicemail where it might leave evidence of impossibility that he wasn't prepared to confront. On the 5th ring, driven by a combination of curiosity and terror that made avoidance feel more dangerous than engagement, he answered his own call. "Hello," he said into the phone, his voice barely above a whisper, unsure what kind of response such an impossible conversation might produce. The silence that followed felt different from the empty line he had experienced during Tuesday's unknown call. This silence had weight and presence, as if someone was indeed on the other end, but struggling to find words for a situation that existed outside normal parameters of human communication. Then, through the phone's speaker, he heard his own voice responding from somewhere that sounded exactly like his apartment, but somehow wasn't quite the same space he was sitting in. "Hello," came the response, carrying his own inflection and tone, but somehow distant and hollow, as if spoken from the bottom of a well, or through layers of glass that separated identical words running parallel to each other. The conversation with himself lasted exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, though time seemed to move differently during those impossible moments, stretching and compressing like reality itself. He was struggling to accommodate an experience that shouldn't exist within the normal boundaries of human interaction. His own voice spoke to him through the phone with perfect clarity, carrying the same slight hoarseness that came from too much coffee and not enough sleep. The same tendency to drop consonants when he was tired, the same unconscious patterns of speech that he had been developing for over 4 decades without really noticing them until now, when they were reflected back at him from a source that defied every rational explanation, the other version of himself. And there seemed to be no other way to think about the voice that carried his exact vocal patterns and speech rhythms, was asking questions that he found himself answering, despite the impossibility of the situation. Where was he calling from? How long had the knocking been happening? Did he remember the exact timing of when it started? The questions were delivered with a tone of urgent curiosity, as if the other voice was conducting some kind of investigation into shared experiences that somehow existed across whatever impossible divide, separated 2 versions of the same person having the same conversation from different sides of some unimaginable boundary. What disturbed him most wasn't the technical impossibility of receiving a call from his own number, though that alone should have been enough to shatter his understanding of how telecommunications worked. What disturbed him was how normal the conversation felt once the initial shock wore off. How easily he fell into the rhythm of discussing his experiences with someone who understood them perfectly, because they were apparently having identical experiences from some parallel perspective. The other voice described the same pattern of knocks, the same timing during phone calls, the same growing isolation as fear of the phenomenon drove him away from normal human contact. They were living the same nightmare from opposite sides of some mirror that reflected experience rather than image. The knocks came during this impossible conversation too, precisely 18 minutes and 37 seconds after the call began, just as they had during his conversation with his mother. But this time they came from both sides of the connection. He heard them in his apartment. 3 deliberate strikes that seemed to emanate from the kitchen area, while simultaneously hearing identical knocks through the phone speaker, originating from whatever space the other version of himself occupied. The synchronization was perfect, as if the same invisible force was making the same announcement in 2 identical but separate locations, marking time in realities that ran parallel to each other, but somehow remained connected through the electronic bridge of their impossible phone call. When the call ended, and he was never certain whether he had hung up first or the other voice had disconnected, the apartment felt fundamentally changed in ways that went beyond the simple addition of another inexplicable experience to his growing collection of impossible events. The silence that followed carried a different quality than the familiar quiet he had grown accustomed to during his months of solitary living. This silence felt inhabited, as if the conversation had opened some kind of doorway between his space and wherever the other version of himself existed, creating a permanent connection that might manifest in ways he couldn't predict or control. The phone sat on his coffee table like evidence of crossing a threshold from which there might be no return, from a world where mystery was something that happened to other people to one where he was apparently living inside the kind of story he had always assumed existed only in fiction. Morning arrived with the weight of accumulated impossibilities pressing against his consciousness like a physical presence, transforming the familiar routine of coffee and shower into mechanical actions performed by someone who was no longer certain about the basic nature of reality. The conversation with himself had been too detailed, too consistent, too perfectly synchronized to dismiss as a stress-induced hallucination or technical malfunction. Every attempt at rational explanation collapsed under the specificity of what had occurred. the identical speech patterns, the shared knowledge of experiences that should have been completely private, the simultaneous knocks that had occurred in two separate but apparently connected spaces. He called in sick to work, using a voice that sounded hollow even to his own ears as he left a voicemail, explaining that he was dealing with a family emergency that required his immediate attention. The lie felt necessary but inadequate, a poor substitute for the truth that he was conducting an investigation into phenomena that challenged everything he thought he knew about the relationship between individual consciousness and external reality. How could he explain to his supervisor that he needed time off to research whether it was possible to have phone conversations with alternate versions of himself, or whether there were documented cases of people hearing synchronized knocks during telecommunications that seemed to originate from parallel dimensions? The apartment became his laboratory, though he had no clear methodology for investigating experiences that existed outside the boundaries of conventional science and rational inquiry. He started by documenting everything he could remember about the knocks, their timing, their apparent source, the specific moments during phone calls when they occurred. The pattern was becoming clearer through repetition. The sounds always came during conversations with other people, always 3 knocks in the same rhythm, always at a specific point in each call that seemed to correspond to moments of deeper connection or emotional significance. They weren't random interruptions but seemed to be triggered by something about the quality of communication itself, as if the act of truly connecting with another human consciousness created conditions that allowed something else to manifest. The internet provided a rabbit hole of possibilities that ranged from technical explanations involving electromagnetic interference and building acoustics to paranormal theories about parallel dimensions and electronic voice phenomena. Forums dedicated to unexplained experiences contained dozens of accounts from people who described similar incidents, mysterious sounds during phone calls, conversations with voices that seemed familiar but impossible, calls from their own numbers that led to encounters with alternate versions of themselves. Reading these accounts provided both comfort and terror, comfort in knowing that he wasn't alone in experiencing impossible phenomena, terror in realizing that if these accounts were genuine, then reality was far more complex and unpredictable than he had ever imagined. But the more he researched, the more he realized that documentation and external validation wouldn't resolve his situation. The knocks, the impossible phone call, the growing sense that his apartment had become some kind of intersection between different versions of reality. These weren't problems that could be solved through internet research or scientific analysis. They were experiences that demanded direct engagement, a willingness to step further into territory that challenged every assumption about how the world operated. The question wasn't whether what was happening to him was possible according to conventional understanding, but what he was going to do about phenomena that were clearly real regardless of their impossibility. By afternoon, as he sat surrounded by printed articles and handwritten notes that documented his attempts to understand his situation, he realized that investigation had become another form of avoidance. He was treating the knocks and the impossible phone call as problems to be solved rather than experiences to be lived, maintaining the illusion that rational analysis could provide safety and control over phenomena that seemed to exist specifically to demonstrate the limits of rational control. The apartment felt charged with expectation, as if the morning's research had been noticed by whatever force was responsible for his experiences, and his continued avoidance of direct engagement was becoming untenable in ways that went beyond simple curiosity or fear. The revelation came not through research or analysis, but through simple observation of patterns that had been present from the beginning, but were only becoming clear through repetition and attention. The knocks didn't occur during every phone call. They happened specifically during conversations that involved emotional connection, moments when he was genuinely engaging with another person, rather than simply exchanging information or conducting business. His mother's worried calls triggered them because they carried the weight of love and concern that transcended simple communication. The impossible call from himself had produced them because it represented the deepest possible form of connection. Literal conversation with his own consciousness across some unimaginable divide. This recognition shifted his understanding of what was happening from random supernatural harassment to something more purposeful and potentially meaningful. The knocks weren't interrupting his phone calls. They were responding to them, marking moments when communication transcended the simple transmission of words and became genuine connection between conscious beings. Whatever force was responsible for the sounds seemed to be attracted to or triggered by authenticity in human interaction. The rare moments when conversation moved beyond surface exchange into territories where people actually heard and understood each other across the electronic bridges that connected their separate experiences. The timing of the phenomenon's emergence also began to make sense when viewed through this lens of connection and isolation. The knocks had started exactly 3 months and 12 days after his divorce became final, during the period when his isolation had become most complete and his hunger for genuine human contact most acute. His apartment had become a space defined by disconnection from his ex-wife, from friends who had belonged more to his married life than his individual existence, from the easy intimacy that comes with sharing daily life with another person. The mysterious sounds had emerged precisely when his need for connection was greatest and his access to it most limited, as if the universe had noticed his isolation and decided to provide evidence that connection was possible in ways he had never imagined. But understanding the pattern didn't make the experiences less unsettling or provide clear guidance about how to respond to them. If the knocks were indeed some kind of response to genuine human connection, then avoiding phone calls wasn't just protecting him from mysterious sounds, it was cutting him off from the very experiences that the sounds seemed to celebrate or mark. The previous day's experiment in deliberate disconnection had protected him from supernatural harassment, but at the cost of relationships and responsibilities that gave his life meaning and structure. He was being forced to choose between connection that came with inexplicable consequences and isolation that provided safety, but eliminated everything that made existence bearable. The weight of this choice pressed against him throughout the afternoon as he sat in his apartment surrounded by the evidence of his investigation, but no closer to a resolution that would allow him to maintain both his sanity and his relationships. The phone sat silent on his coffee table, but its silence felt temporary, charged with the potential for experiences that might push him further into territory where rational explanation became impossible and direct engagement with mystery became the only path forward. Whatever was happening to him was accelerating, becoming more frequent and more impossible with each occurrence, demanding decisions about how much strangeness he was willing to accept in exchange for maintaining connections to the world beyond his increasingly isolated existence. As evening approached, bringing with it the familiar weight of solitude and the growing certainty that another impossible experience was approaching, he found himself preparing not for avoidance or research but for engagement. The knocks, the impossible phone call, the growing sense that his apartment had become some kind of intersection between different versions of reality. These weren't problems to be solved but mysteries to be experienced, invitations to step into a larger understanding of what connection between conscious beings might actually involve. The question was no longer whether he was losing his mind or encountering something supernatural, but whether he had the courage to follow these phenomena wherever they might lead. even if that destination existed completely outside his understanding of how reality was supposed to operate. At 8:47 p.m., as he sat in his living room chair, staring at his phone and trying to prepare himself for whatever impossible experience might come next, the device began to ring with a tone he had never heard before. Not the standard ring that had marked all his previous calls, but something that sounded like bells, or maybe wind chimes, or possibly voices singing in harmony, so distant that only their melodic structure remained audible. The caller ID showed not a phone number, but a single word that appeared and disappeared so quickly he almost missed it. Choose. The display flickered between this word and his own phone number, as if the device couldn't decide whether this was another impossible call from himself or something else entirely, some kind of communication that existed outside normal parameters of telecommunications technology. He answered on the third ring, no longer surprised by his own willingness to engage with phenomena that challenged everything he thought he knew about reality. "Hello," he said, his voice carrying a calmness that surprised him, as if the accumulated impossibilities of the past week had somehow prepared him for this moment of decision, rather than driving him further into confusion and fear. The voice that responded was not his own this time, but something that carried elements of every voice he had ever known. His mother's concern, his ex-wife's familiar cadence, his father's measured wisdom, his own inner dialogue, woven together into something that was both entirely foreign and completely recognizable. "The knocking stops when you stop needing it," the voice said, each word carrying weight that seemed to bypass his rational mind and speak directly to understanding that existed at a deeper level than conscious analysis. Connection doesn't require explanation. Choice doesn't require certainty. The sounds were never the message. They were the invitation to listen more carefully to what you already knew, but were afraid to acknowledge. The words felt like solutions to questions he hadn't known how to ask, explanations that made perfect sense, even though they addressed experiences that shouldn't exist according to any framework of reality he had been taught to accept. "What am I supposed to choose?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer, had been knowing it since the first mysterious phone call had brought those 3 deliberate knocks into his carefully ordered existence. The choice wasn't between supernatural engagement and rational avoidance, between accepting impossible phenomena and maintaining his grip on normal reality. The choice was between isolation and connection, between the safety of disconnection and the risk of genuine relationship with whatever forces, human, supernatural, or something beyond either category, were trying to reach him through the electronic bridges that linked his private space to the larger universe of conscious experience. "You're supposed to choose whether to keep the phone number," the voice replied, and suddenly he understood that everything that had been happening, the knocks, the impossible calls, the growing sense that his apartment had become some kind of intersection between different versions of reality, had been leading to this moment of decision. His phone number wasn't just a sequence of digits that allowed people to reach him. It was apparently some kind of address that made him accessible to forms of communication that existed outside normal human interaction. Keeping it meant accepting that his life would continue to include experiences that challenged rational explanation. Changing it meant returning to the kind of isolation that was slowly destroying everything that gave his existence meaning and purpose. The conversation continued for what felt like hours, but registered on his phone as only 17 minutes, covering topics that ranged from the nature of consciousness and connection to practical advice about maintaining relationships, while acknowledging that reality was far stranger and more complex than most people were willing to admit. The voice explained that the knocks had been a kind of notification system, alerting him to moments when his conversations transcended simple information exchange and became genuine communion between conscious beings. They weren't supernatural harassment, but rather celebration, marking instances when human connection overcame the barriers of isolation and electronic mediation to create something approaching real intimacy and understanding. When the call ended, he sat in the silence of his apartment with a sense of completion that he hadn't experienced since before his divorce, a feeling that the questions that had been driving him toward isolation and despair had finally been answered in ways that made forward movement possible. He understood now that the choice between mysterious connection and safe isolation wasn't really a choice at all. Isolation was slowly killing him, while connection, however strange and inexplicable it might be, offered the possibility of continued growth and relationship and meaning. The knocks had been trying to tell him this all along, marking moments when he successfully reached across the electronic void to touch another human consciousness, celebrating his ability to maintain connection despite the forces that pushed him toward complete solitude. He picked up his phone and called his mother, not because he had anything particular to say, but because he wanted to hear her voice and share with her the relief of someone who had been lost and was finally finding his way home. When the knocks came 18 minutes into their conversation, 3 deliberate strikes that sounded like applause echoing from the walls of his apartment, he smiled instead of fearing them, recognizing them finally for what they had always been, not intrusion but invitation, not harassment but celebration, not evidence of supernatural persecution, but proof that connection between conscious beings was always inevitably a kind of miracle that deserved acknowledgement and praise. The mystery hadn't been solved so much as accepted, transformed from a source of terror into a reminder that reality was large enough to include experiences that existed beyond the boundaries of rational explanation, and that sometimes the most profound truths came not through understanding but through the courage to remain open to possibilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about the relationship between isolation and connection, between the possible and the impossible, between the voice that speaks and the consciousness that listens across whatever distance, electronic, supernatural, or simply human, separate one heart from another, in the vast and mysterious universe of shared experience. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a shock, not the usual hush of an empty room, but the vacuum left behind when reality cracks and something ancient breathes through the fissure. That's what he felt as the voice faded, leaving him alone with the echo of its final words and a phone that glowed like a forgotten lantern in the dark. The apartment was silent again, but it wasn't empty. Something had shifted in the very architecture of his perception. It was like the world had held its breath, waiting. Then came the first knock. 1, 2, 3, slow and steady, unmistakable. His spine locked into place. The knocks didn't come from the closet, or the walls, or the front door. They didn't even come from outside his own head. They came from everywhere at once, layered, overlapping, impossibly synchronized across dimensions he could feel but not name. He remained frozen, phone still pressed to his ear, the screen unchanged. The call hadn't ended, the voice hadn't returned, but the sound had. Then came the second set. Another 3, but not identical. These knocks weren't just sounds anymore. They had intention, meaning. He could feel it vibrating beneath his skin, like the murmur of approaching thunder. Only it wasn't pressure in the air, it was pressure in time. The air in his apartment thickened, as though soaked in the residue of old dreams. The ceiling creaked above him, but not in protest, more like acknowledgement. The walls no longer felt solid. They flexed at the edges of his vision, as if the geometry of his home was struggling to hold its shape. With each knock, his own heartbeat seemed to align with something larger, something beyond the borders of his understanding. His legs moved, slowly, like a puppet's pulled by invisible strings, and he found himself pacing back and forth between the couch and the kitchen, hoping that motion might keep the surreal from collapsing entirely into horror. The knocking didn't stop, it changed. At first it was still in threes, sharp, rhythmic bursts like signals, but then the sequence began to multiply. 3, then 6, then 12. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. A kind of counting, or maybe a code, a pattern. His mind tried to latch onto it, hungry for control, desperate for order. He counted aloud, 3, 6, 9, until the words started to blur. The knocks weren't just happening around him now. They were happening inside him, in his chest, behind his eyes, inside the meat of his thoughts. His fingers tingled as if the phone had become a live wire. He considered hanging up, but something told him he couldn't, that if he ended the call, he might sever more than just a connection. He might sever himself from what he didn't know. Reality, sanity, himself. He walked to the center of the room, his feet oddly heavy, and the knocking grew faint for a moment, only to return louder than ever when he passed through the threshold between the kitchen and the hallway. Something about that space, the corner where light from the bedroom met the dimness of the living room, felt charged, like standing between two mirror worlds. That's when the voice returned, low and layered, like it was being spoken, not by one version of him, but by dozens, stacked atop each other, each with a different inflection, a different kind of exhaustion. You've already chosen, it said. Every time you picked up the phone, every time you let someone in, you listened when others would have run, you answered when you should have ignored. And now, they're listening too. He didn't know who they were, but he knew viscerally that the voice wasn't speaking in metaphor. Something had heard him. Not just his words, but the emptiness beneath them. Something had been watching his isolation, noting each call like notches in a tally. Something had been waiting for him to listen. Then the knocking stopped, not gradually, abruptly, like someone had pulled a needle from the grooves of a vinyl record. The absence of the sound was worse than the noise itself. The stillness that followed didn't feel like relief. It felt like retreat. The kind of pause predators make before lunging. The phone vibrated once, sharply, and the screen flickered. For a split second, he saw something not meant to be seen. His face, not as a reflection, but as a caller ID photo that had never existed. A portrait of him taken in a place he'd never been. Behind him in that image, a closet door, open just a crack, and two eyes, his own staring from the shadows. Then the screen changed again. One word appeared, pulsing slowly in white against black. Go, then another, back. Then a final message that made the hairs on his arms rise like tiny barometers of dread, to where it began. He stood at his door for a long time, not because he didn't know what to do next, but because deep down he did, and knowing terrified him. Go back to where it began, the message had said. But what was the beginning? His mind sifted through possible answers. Tuesday night's first knock, the divorce, the day he first moved into apartment 4B. Or was the beginning something more abstract, something hidden in his past, in the private corners of memory he hadn't dared revisit since his life began unraveling? The doorknob felt cold beneath his fingers. He didn't remember grabbing it. The phone was still clutched in his other hand. Screen black now, inert like nothing had happened. But everything had happened. He stepped into the hallway, and the building greeted him like it always had, with the heavy scent of someone else's cooking and the faint hum of lives playing out behind closed doors. But tonight, it felt different. The hallway didn't feel like an in-between space anymore. It felt like a tunnel. The elevator at the end of the corridor dinged softly, even though he hadn't pressed the button. The doors opened with a mechanical sigh, revealing an empty box bathed in flickering light. He hesitated. That elevator had always been unreliable. It creaked, stalled, sometimes refused to move, unless you begged. But tonight, it stood ready, patient, waiting for him. The walk toward it felt longer than usual, each footstep echoing like it belonged to someone else. As he entered, the door slid shut behind him without prompt. The buttons on the panel didn't glow, but the elevator began to descend anyway, and not just to the first floor. The screen above the door didn't show numbers. It showed letters, one at a time. B, then A, then C, then K. He should have laughed. It was absurd. But the tightness in his chest, the way his mouth had gone dry, told him this was anything but funny. He reached to press something, anything, but the panel was now blank. No buttons, just smooth, cold steel. When the elevator stopped, the doors didn't open right away. He stood inside, holding his breath like a swimmer waiting to surface. Then, with a slow mechanical groan, the metal doors parted to reveal nothing, at least not at first. It was darkness beyond, complete and perfect, as if the world had ended on the other side of those doors. But as his eyes adjusted, he saw it, faint at first, then clearer, with each second. A hallway, not the one in his building, older, narrower, familiar in a way that made his stomach twist. It was lined with peeling wallpaper he hadn't seen in over 30 years, lit by a flickering ceiling light that buzzed like a fly caught in a jar. This was the hallway outside his childhood bedroom. He knew it before he even stepped out of the elevator, knew it by the slight incline of the floor, the way the light bent around the corners, the soft thud of something rocking on its base. His old wooden horse, long broken, always left by the door. He walked slowly, as if afraid to disturb the memories that hovered like ghosts in the air. The floorboards creaked in the same way they always had under his bare feet, and the air carried that strange scent of old dust and something faintly metallic, like the scent of blood diluted in water. He reached the door to what had once been his room. It looked the same, faded blue paint, stickers half peeled from a time when he believed in space travel and comic book heroes. His name still scratched into the wood near the handle, clumsy, reversed letters from a 6-year-old's eager hand. But something else was scratched below it now. A date, not one he recognized. October 11th, 1989. He reached for the doorknob, but it turned on its own. Slowly, reluctantly, the door creaked open, and he braced himself. For what? He didn't know. Inside, the room was preserved like a forgotten exhibit. Posters still clung to the walls, torn at the edges, their colors dimmed by time. The bed was made, the sheets still printed with rocket ships and constellations. A single lamp glowed on the nightstand, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. And there, sitting in the corner, just beneath the closet door, was the rotary phone. Red, glossy, out of place. He hadn't seen it in years, not since his father had removed it after his mother found him talking into it late at night. to no one. But here it was. Not a replica, the real thing. He felt it, deep in his gut. This was where it began. Not with the knocks in apartment 4. Not with the divorce or the silence, or the isolation. It began here. In this room. In that phone. In a forgotten conversation with someone, or something, that had never stopped trying to reach him. Something he had forgotten until now. He approached it slowly, every footstep sticky with the weight of memory. He knelt beside the phone, reached for it, and felt an electric shiver travel from his fingertips to his spine. Dust coated the receiver, but beneath the grind, it was warm, alive. He picked it up and held it to his ear. No dial tone, just static. Then the static cleared, and a voice, his voice, but younger, more hesitant, spoke on the other end. "Are you still there?" the boy whispered. "I've been waiting." The world tilted. The air around him constricted. His pulse roared in his ears. "Who are you talking to?" he asked the voice. But he already knew the answer. "To you," the boy said. "I told you I would never hang up. You promised you wouldn't either." He remembered now, the midnight calls. The imaginary friend no one believed was real. The closet door that opened just a crack during the calls. The sense that he was never truly alone. He had forgotten, but the voice hadn't. Tears filled his eyes. Not from fear, from recognition. The knocks, the phone, the messages, they weren't warnings, they were reminders. Something inside him, something lost to time and pain and adult logic, had been trying to reconnect. Not to haunt him, to save him. From what, he didn't know. But the truth was suddenly clear. The line had never disconnected. The knocking was the sound of memory, demanding entry. Of a boy who had made a promise in the dark and waited decades for the other half of the conversation. He gripped the phone tighter. "I'm here," he said. "I'm still here." The boy laughed softly, and the sound was so real, so full of light, it undid him. "Good," the voice said. "Now we can open the door." The closet door was already ajar, but only slightly, just enough to show a sliver of darkness deeper than the rest of the room. It hadn't moved. Not an inch. But now that he was looking at it, really looking, he realized it hadn't changed in 30 years. The chipped brass knob, the peeling paint at the bottom edge, where his toy cars had banged into it, the faint scuff marks near the floor where he'd once tried to wedge it shut with a chair during a week of night. Terrors he barely remembered. And now, here it stood, still slightly open, as if it had been waiting all this time for him to come back and finish what he started. The voice on the phone had gone quiet after its last sentence. Not disconnected. Just waiting, like the closet. He placed the receiver back in its cradle, with a gentleness usually reserved for things buried with reverence. He stood and walked toward the door slowly, each step heavier than the last, as though the floor itself resisted his approach. The air in the room had thickened, not with cold, but with the pressure of memory long denied. This was more than fear. This was confrontation, not with a monster or a ghost, but with a version of himself left behind. That door had once held back the worst nights of his childhood. The hours when he'd lie in bed with the covers pulled to his chin, listening to the gentle creak of the floorboards, as if something inside was walking, pacing, waiting for him to fall asleep. He remembered calling out to his parents once, only to have them tell him it was just a dream, that he was imagining it. But now, standing here as an adult who had heard knocks from nowhere and spoken to himself on the phone, he knew better. The closet had always been more than a place for clothes and forgotten toys. It had been a threshold. Maybe the first one. The knocking hadn't started in his apartment. That was just where he heard it again. But the origin, The seed of it was here behind this door. He could feel it in his bones. It wasn't just a symbolic place. Something was behind it. And whatever it was, it had waited a long time. He reached for the knob with a hand that trembled despite himself. He expected cold metal, but it was warm, almost hot. He paused, listened. The house was silent. The hallway behind him was gone. Not just out of sight. No, as if stepping into this room had removed him from the rest of reality. He could no longer hear the hum of distant city life. No voices, no time, just the pulsing quiet of a world that held its breath. He turned the knob, slowly, expecting resistance, finding none. The door opened with a soft click, as if it had been unlocked all along. Inside was not darkness. Not exactly. It was light, but warped, like looking into a tunnel made of old mirrors, each reflecting a slightly different version of the same space. The back wall of the closet no longer existed. Instead, it gave way to a narrow corridor, one that bent downward at a gradual slope, lined with mismatched wallpaper and dim bulbs that blinked in a rhythm almost, but not quite, synchronized with his heartbeat. He stepped inside, and the floor beneath him felt like carpet, though he could see wood. Sounds returned, but not sounds from the house. Voices, footsteps, phone rings, snippets of conversations he had lived through, some recent, others from childhood. It was like walking through an archive of his life, except nothing was still. The sounds moved with him, growing louder or fainter as he passed. The corridor seemed endless, though he could always see the next corner. Around each bend was another memory, not visual, but auditory. He passed the voice of his ex-wife, telling him she was unhappy. The sound of his father laughing the day he taught him how to ride a bike. The distant sound of the judge declaring the divorce finalized. These weren't hallucinations. They were recordings played in perfect fidelity, each wrapped in the acoustics of the moment. Then he heard the knocks, not just the familiar three, but variations. In some memories, they were louder, more urgent. In others, softer, hesitant. He stopped at one particularly sharp set, positioned right after the echo of a phone conversation with his mother from years ago. That was when he first heard the idea of coming home. That conversation, he hadn't remembered it until now, but the knock had been there too, unnoticed, until now. And suddenly it clicked, not as a theory, but as knowing. The knocks weren't just arbitrary, they were markers, like footnotes in a story he hadn't realized he'd been telling his entire life. They arrived when he made a choice, when he opened a door, literal or emotional, when he reached out instead of retreating, when he let someone in. Every knock was a signal, not from something trying to get to him, but from something trying to wake him up. He felt it like revelation in his chest. The closet wasn't just a portal, it was a mirror. And this corridor wasn't a haunting, it was a trail, a map of everything he'd ever risked to connect with another soul, a path not of terror, but of proof. He kept walking, faster now. The knocks became rhythmic again, steady, familiar. They no longer scared him, they encouraged him. Keep going, they said. He followed the sounds until the corridor ended in a wooden door, simple, unmarked, very much like the front door of his apartment in 4B. He reached for the knob. The door opened before he touched it, and on the other side was his apartment, but not quite. It was 4B, but filled with warmth. Light, the kind of golden hour light that only comes in dreams. Everything was familiar, yet subtly altered. The walls were painted a color he'd never had the courage to choose. The table held 2 plates, not one. The couch had an indentation where someone else had clearly been sitting, and across the room, sitting in his usual chair, was himself. The other version, the one who'd answered the impossible call. They locked eyes and both smiled, not out of joy, but relief. Because the knocking had finally led him back to the part of himself he'd abandoned long ago. They didn't speak at first. They just looked at each other. Two versions of the same man, separated by choices, by fear, by time. The one in the chair, the other him, wasn't a mirror image. He was similar, yes, but older in a way that wasn't about years. He carried the weight of remembered grief and unrealized connection, and yet there was light behind his eyes. Not joy exactly, more like clarity. He looked comfortable, like someone who had spent a long time alone, but had made peace with it. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was full, rich with the unspoken acknowledgement that both of them had walked different paths through the same life. The air was warm here, infused with a soft hum, like distant music vibrating through the walls. It wasn't the silence of absence, it was the silence of understanding. And then the other him leaned forward, clasped his hands together, and said softly, "Took you long enough." The words landed without malice. They were not a complaint. They were a welcome. He stepped farther into the room, his footsteps soundless on the hardwood floor. Everything about this version of the apartment felt familiar, yet not fully his. The colors were warmer, the bookshelves were fuller, the phone on the table wasn't cracked, the coat by the door wasn't his. A pair of shoes, small, worn, unmistakably feminine, sat neatly by the mat, paired with his own. Someone else lived here, or had. He wasn't sure. The room didn't feel haunted. It felt remembered, like it belonged to the life he could have lived. The life he might still have. The other him patted the second chair. "Come sit, you'll want to hear it all." And strangely he did. He wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the knocks, not of the voice, not of himself. He took the seat across, lowering himself like someone entering a sacred space. For a long moment, they simply sat. Two men who were one man, staring across a short divide, stretched by long years. Finally, the other him spoke again, voice measured and quiet. "This place, this version, isn't real in the way you think. It's a possibility, a story you wrote without knowing. Every time you chose to connect, every time you answered the call, stayed on the line, listened instead of running, you added to this." He gestured around the room. "It isn't perfect. It's not meant to be. It's just true. As true as anything can be when you've lived a life on the edge of silence." His voice cracked a little on that last word, and he looked down, rubbing the bridge of his nose like he was trying to hold himself together. "You have no idea how long I waited." "I think I do," he replied. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled in his lap. "I didn't know I left anyone behind." The other him chuckled, not bitterly, but softly, like someone amused by the strangeness of fate. "You didn't, not at first. You just stopped answering. Not the phone, the world. You built walls. I watched it happen. Every time you ignored a call, every time you chose the safety of solitude over the risk of connection. I felt it. I heard it. The knocks were never to scare you. They were to remind you that someone was still waiting." He paused, "that you were still waiting for yourself." It made sense now, in the kind of way that bypasses logic and buries itself directly into the soul. The knocking had never come from outside. It had always come from within. A part of himself, trapped, muted, isolated, had been trying to get back in. They sat in silence again, but this time it was different. There was peace in it. The apartment hummed softly around them, alive with the echoes of lives half-lived and moments half-felt. "This place," the other said. "It's a bridge, between versions, between choices. You could leave now, forget this ever happened, go back to the knocking. It'll never stop. Not until you listen for real, not until you live." He looked up, his expression filled with the quiet intensity of someone delivering truth without demand. Or you can step through. You can become the man who stayed, the one who stopped running, who answered, not just the phone, but the life that was always calling. He gestured behind him. The hallway he had entered from was gone. In its place was another door, taller, narrower, black as ink. That leads forward, but only if you're ready. He stood, finally, and crossed to the door. His hand hovered above the knob. "What's on the other side?" he asked. The other him smiled. "Whatever comes next, but you won't be alone anymore." That made him pause, because that had always been the point, hadn't it? Everything, the divorce, the silence, the unanswered calls, the fear, it all came down to that one gnawing truth. He didn't want to be alone anymore. And not just in the apartment, in himself. He had walled off so much, pain, joy, memory, that even he couldn't find his way back. Until now, until the knocking. He took a deep breath. Not the shallow kind that comes before panic, but the deep, grounding breath of someone who is finally ready. And then, without another word, he turned the knob. On the other side was not light or darkness, not home or mystery. On the other side was a phone ringing, a single tone, steady and clear, cutting through everything. He stepped into it, and for the first time, he didn't hesitate. He picked up the receiver and answered. "Hello?" he said. A pause, then a voice answered back. His mother. "Oh, thank God, you're all right," she said, her voice shaking with relief. He blinked. He was back in his apartment. 4B, the real one. But everything had changed. The lighting was softer. The space didn't echo as much. The walls felt less like barriers and more like shelter. He sat down, phone still to his ear, and listened to her talk about her day. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to, because this time he was listening. And somewhere, faint but clear, he heard it. 3 soft knocks, not behind the closet, not inside the walls, but from inside his chest. And for the first time, they didn't scare him. They welcomed him home. The morning came without fanfare, without blaring alarms or golden rays cutting dramatically through the blinds. It just arrived, like something returning after a long absence. He awoke in his bed, not the remembered version, not the echo of his childhood, but the real one. The mattress too firm on one side, the sheets tangled from another restless night. But today felt different, not because the knocking had stopped. It hadn't, but because he had changed. The fear was gone. The dread that had stalked his every movement, that had waited behind every ring of the phone, no longer lingered in the shadows. The knocks still came, but they no longer asked questions. They gave answers. They were not messages from something outside. They were from within. A part of him, older than memory, was finally speaking clearly. He sat on the edge of the bed, his bare feet pressing against the worn hardwood. Outside, the city was waking up in the usual way. Horns, birds, the dull roar of a world reassembling itself for another day of distractions. But inside, something remained still, poised, like a breath held too long. His phone was on the nightstand, screen dark, inert. He reached for it with the ease of someone no longer afraid of what it might bring. He half expected a missed call from his mother or a message from work. But what greeted him instead was a single notification. Voicemail, one new message. Unknown number. He didn't recognize the time it was received. 3:33 a.m. That made his stomach twitch, not in fear but recognition. Something had happened during the night, something his conscious mind hadn't caught. He tapped play. The voice was his. Not distorted, not altered, just his, but tired, slower. A version of himself speaking not in panic or mystery, but something close to reverence. If you're hearing this, it means you're still listening. Good. That's all it ever was, listening. Not just to others, to yourself. We spend so much time running from our own voice, from our own truth. But the line's always open. You just have to pick up. A pause, a soft inhale. I think we've always existed like this, layered, folded over ourselves like pages in a book. But most people never flip past the first chapter. You did. You kept going. The message ended with a sound, 3 soft knocks. Then silence. Not ominous, but final. Like a conversation ending. Not because it had to, but because nothing more needed to be said. He stared at the screen long after it went black again. The voice had been him. Yes, but also not. It was the version he'd met beyond the threshold. The one who had stayed, who had made a home inside the echo of possibility. It wasn't a warning, it was a gift. A reminder that the door between what is and what might be doesn't always slam shut. Sometimes, it just waits for you to knock back. He rose from the bed, showered, dressed without the numb routines that had once filled his mornings with fog. He made coffee, not to drown out the silence, but to enjoy it. The apartment was still small, the fridge still hummed, the hallway still smelled faintly of someone cooking something that was probably burning. But everything felt newly lit, as if someone had replaced the ordinary bulbs of his life with a softer, truer hue. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and his phone, waiting for it to ring, not out of dread, but curiosity. But it didn't, not that morning. The silence was not a punishment, it was an answer. The knocking came once, at 9:13, while he stirred sugar into his second cup. 3 deliberate taps from inside the cabinet under the sink. He didn't move, he just listened. They came again at 11:40, this time behind the bathroom mirror. Again he only paused, acknowledged. The knocks no longer asked why. They only echoed yes. Later that afternoon, as he opened the window and let in a gust of cool autumn air, the phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered it without hesitation. "Hello," he said. But this time there was no voice, only a recording, his own, from the first call he'd received that Tuesday night. The call that had started everything, a loop, now closed. He played it back twice, letting the memory wash over him. His confused voice, the silence on the other end, and then those first 3 knocks. It was as if the universe had captured that moment and was offering it back to him, not as a threat, but as a promise. It was real. You weren't imagining it. All of it happened, and more would still come, if you chose to keep answering. That was the key now, choice. He was no longer trapped in a pattern. He was the one writing it, and there was something deeply liberating in that. For the first time in weeks, he opened the window not just to let in air, but to breathe, deeply, with intention. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, But he knew now that no sound, not even the impossible ones, would ever control him again. He had heard himself, and he had answered. Night came gently, folding over the city like a warm sheet. He didn't reach for the TV or the usual distraction. Instead, he sat in the dark with a book, his phone nearby but silent, until, just after midnight, it rang again. Not a number, not a contact, just a single word across the screen. Listen, and so he did. He answered. No words this time, no voice, only the sound of breathing, his own, and another, and the unmistakable hum of two worlds overlapping, connected by a thread stretched taut across silence. No knocking, no fear, just the steady rhythmic truth of presence, of knowing someone or something was there, still listening, and always had been. Sleep, when it came, was neither heavy nor light. It wasn't dreamless, but the dreams weren't like before. There were no distorted corridors, no impossible versions of his apartment, no whispers from behind closet doors. Instead, the dreams were layered. Some silent, some loud, all lucid. He dreamt of rooms he'd never visited, people he'd forgotten, and versions of himself doing ordinary things with extraordinary calm. In one, he was fixing a bicycle for a little girl whose face he couldn't see but felt he recognized. In another, he sat across from someone who looked like his ex-wife, but happier, laughing, whole. In another, he sat in silence with no one at all, only the sound of distant bells and a phone that rang once, then stopped. The dreams didn't feel like stories. They felt like memories, but not of things that had already happened. Memories of what could have. He woke not with panic, but with a lingering stillness, the kind that settles deep in the bones and waits to be acknowledged. The phone was still on the nightstand, still dark, still waiting, but it didn't feel like a threat anymore. It felt like an invitation. He reached for it, not with hesitation but with care, and checked the call log. There were no new calls, no new voicemails, just the one from 3:33 a.m. the night before, marked now with a strange detail. It had no duration, just a dash. As if time hadn't passed while the message played, as if it had existed outside of time. He stared at it for a long moment, unsure if it was a glitch or something else. And then, slowly, something occurred to him. He had never asked what happened when he didn't answer. He had never considered what kind of silence the line held when he chose not to pick up. He stood, the floor cold beneath his feet, and walked to the kitchen. The knocking hadn't come that morning, not yet, but he sensed it, like pressure before a storm, not threatening, just present, expectant. He made coffee, then tea, then neither. He sat at the table, hands folded, eyes closed, just listening, and slowly the layers of sound began to return. Not through the phone, through the walls, through the air, through himself. He heard laughter from 3 years ago, a car horn from a trip to Ohio, the sound of footsteps in the hallway when his ex-wife used to come home late. These weren't hallucinations, they were resonances, like echoes, returning, not from walls but from memory. As if by opening the line within himself, the universe had begun to play back everything he had missed, while he'd been too afraid to listen. At 10:47, the phone rang. It was the same number, no digits, no name, just the word open. This time, he didn't rush to answer. He let it ring once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th, he picked up. "I'm listening," he said. No greeting, no questions, just that. The silence on the other end didn't feel empty. It felt full, like someone was trying to speak without words. And then, softly, a voice came through. Not his, not anyone he recognized, but layered, as if several voices were overlapping. "You're close," it said, "closer than most, but you haven't finished yet." The line crackled, not with static, but with movement. He could hear the sound of paper turning, the fluttering of pages, and what might have been whispering just beneath the edge of recognition. Then, the knocking was never to warn you, it was to guide you toward the place you buried yourself. The words hit like a current through water. They didn't explain anything, but they clarified everything. This wasn't about the apartment, or the phone, or even the strange call from his own number. It was about him, about the parts of himself he had hidden, muted, suppressed, the parts that knocked when he stopped listening. He asked, "Where do I go?" Another pause, another breath. Then the voice answered, softer now, "You've already been. You just weren't ready to open the last door." The call ended. No click, just silence. And then the knock came. Not 3 but 4. The first deviation. His heart skipped. 4 knocks, deliberate, slower, from the same place it had always come, his closet. But this time something inside him leaned forward instead of back. He stood, not to investigate, but to answer. He walked to the closet, not with dread, but with determination. The air was still, unmoving, like the breath of the room had paused. He reached for the doorknob, but this time it turned on its own. The door creaked open, and behind it, instead of coats or shelves or dusty shoes, was something else entirely. A narrow staircase, wooden and dark, leading downward. He blinked. This shouldn't be possible, but impossibility had lost its power over him days ago, or hours ago, or perhaps time had stopped mattering altogether. He stepped inside. The stairs didn't creak. They welcomed. Each step echoed, not into the space around him, but into his memory. With each one, he remembered something he'd forgotten. The night he almost said, "I love you," but didn't. The day he watched his father cry for the first time. The letter he wrote and never sent. This was not just a descent into space. It was a descent into self. At the bottom of the staircase was a single room, small, warm, lit by a single lamp. A table, 2 chairs, and on the table, a phone, red, rotary, identical to the one in his childhood room. It wasn't dusty. It was pristine, waiting. He approached, sat, and placed his hand on the receiver. This was the final call. He could feel it, not as an end, but as a beginning, a return, a rejoining. He picked it up, pressed it to his ear. There was no ring, no silence, just breath, his own. And then the knock came, not from the room, not from above, but from inside the phone. 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a voice, familiar, steady, his own. "Are you finally ready to come home?" it asked. And for the first time in his life, without fear, without pause, he answered, "Yes." The word "yes" didn't echo through the room. It settled, soft and final, like a key slipping into a lock that had waited too long. For a moment, there was nothing else. No hum, no knock, no voice, just stillness. And then, gently, the phone in his hand vibrated, not violently, not like the buzzing urgency of modern alerts, but like a heartbeat, a low, living rhythm. He held it tighter and felt a warmth spreading through his palm, up his arm, into his chest. This was no longer about a phone call. It was a reunion, not with another person, but with a version of himself that had been silenced years ago, the one that had dared to believe in connection, in magic, in meaning, the one that had heard the knocks and answered, not because he understood, but because he trusted. The room around him flickered, not with light, but with sensation. The walls didn't vanish, but they became transparent, as if his awareness passed through them. He saw flashes of moments, like memories on a projector, each one tinted in sepia light. There he was, age 12, sitting by the closet door, holding a plastic cup up against it, listening for voices. There he was, age 19, in the back seat of a car, silently begging someone to ask how he was really doing. Then again, older, standing at a friend's funeral, choking back tears he thought would make him weak. These weren't memories designed to hurt. They were milestones, carved in the quiet between conversations. Each one carried a knock that had gone unnoticed at the time, and yet they had all brought him here. He closed his eyes and listened again. Not to the room, not to the phone, but inward, deep into the place where the knocks had always started. And there it was, a pulse, a rhythm that wasn't his heart, but matched it. 4 beats, a pause, 4 more. But this time, the knocking wasn't trying to get in. It was trying to guide him out. Not out of the room, but out of the loops he'd lived in for so long. The patterns of withdrawal, silence, and doubt. Every unanswered call, every unopened door, every avoided truth. They hadn't closed him off from the world. They had closed him off from himself. This was what the voice had meant. This was what the other version of him had known all along. The only way out was back in. He opened his eyes. The room was no longer small. It had expanded, not physically, but atmospherically. It felt vast, like it touched places he hadn't explored yet. The corners buzzed with quiet energy, as if waiting, on the wall, where before there had been nothing, now hung a mirror. It was old, with a frame made of dark wood, carved in swirling, almost organic shapes that shifted when he wasn't looking directly at them. He stood and walked toward it. His reflection was there, but not entirely his. His face, yes, but his eyes were clearer, his posture more assured. And in the background of the reflection behind him stood every version of himself he'd ever been. Some smiling, some frowning, some looking lost, but all of them facing forward, as if waiting for him to acknowledge them at last. He reached out and touched the glass. It was cool, solid, but as his fingertips met his reflection, the surface rippled, subtly, like water stirred by breath. The phone behind him rang once, a single tone, then silence. He turned on the table. Now was not just the phone. There was also a letter, sealed in an envelope with no writing, no stamp, just a red wax emblem, a circle with 4 small lines marked equidistant around it, like a clock or a compass. He opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper. One line written in firm, cursive handwriting. If you are reading this, it means the line is still open. He smiled, and it wasn't the uncertain, cautious smile of someone who's survived. It was the steady, grounded smile of someone who's returned to presence, to possibility, to truth. He folded the letter and placed it in his coat pocket, as if it were a map he might one day need again. The knocks hadn't come in minutes, but he could feel them, not in fear, but as a guidepost. They would return. He knew, not to haunt, not to test, but to remind that he had made it through the noise, that the silence he feared was never absence, it was invitation. The room began to fade, not like waking from a dream, but like exiting a long, rich memory. He turned back toward the stairs. When he emerged from the closet, it was morning again, real morning, the kind that smells like warm light and carries the faint sounds of life, beginning. His apartment was exactly the same, but it felt entirely new. He didn't rush to check his phone. He didn't flinch when he heard the neighbor's footsteps overhead. He just stood there, barefoot on his creaking floor, and let himself be. The phone, resting on the kitchen counter, buzzed once. He walked over and looked. No caller ID, no message, just one word across the screen. Listen. And so he did. He pressed the phone to his ear and listened. Not for words, not for knocks, but for himself. And in that long, radiant silence, he finally heard everything. The silence was no longer hollow. It was full. So full it buzzed softly in his ears, like the vibration of a distant tuning fork held too long. He stood in the kitchen, holding the phone to his ear, but there was no voice, no knock, just this deep, resonant stillness. It wasn't the absence of sound. He now understood. It was the presence of attention, a silence that waited, that listened. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of that kind of silence. He wasn't rushing to fill it with words or movement. He just stood there, breathing, feeling every breath as if it were a new language being spoken to him. One breath, then another. The phone, warm in his hand, was no longer just a phone. It was a thread stretching across all the versions of himself he'd finally allowed to exist. The call never disconnected. The screen stayed lit, though no voice spoke. He placed the phone on the kitchen counter, screen up, and let it stay there. The light from the window touched the display, casting a halo around the words still lingering at the top. Listen. He made coffee the way he always had, but this time, every step was intentional. The sound of the kettle, the spoon against ceramic, the faint hiss of steam rising. Each sound was part of a symphony he'd tuned out for years. Even his own footsteps, quiet, steady, were new to him. Familiar but deeper, grounded, he moved through his home like someone who had finally been reintroduced to it, who had learned how to be present in the rooms he had long considered haunted. The apartment hadn't changed. He had. The knock came again at 9:06 a.m. Soft, 4 times, from behind the bedroom mirror. He paused, listened, then smiled. There was no need to check. No need to search for something that had already been found. The knocks were no longer warnings. They were greetings, like old friends tapping on the window, reminding him they were still here, that he was not alone, that he had never been. He walked to the mirror, not to open it, not to break through it, but to look into it. His reflection stared back, but it didn't feel like watching a stranger anymore. His eyes were tired, yes, his hair unkempt, but something had shifted. The man in the mirror looked here, grounded, present. He raised a hand. The reflection did the same. A perfect echo, and for the first time, he believed it. He stepped back, let the knock fade, and returned to the table. He had left the phone on speaker, and it still buzzed faintly, like a heartbeat, steady, alive. He sat down, cupped the warm mug in his hands, and waited, not for another knock or a whisper, but for the silence to settle again. And it did, gently, like fog folding over a quiet town at dawn. From this place, from this stillness, the past began to feel less like a weight, and more like a song he had once memorized, but forgotten how to hum. The memories returned, not as flashbacks, but as visits, kind, curious visits. His father's laugh, his mother's worried voice, the night he moved out. The old cat that used to sit by the window and paw at shadows, only it could see. These fragments came not to haunt, but to belong. He welcomed each one, nodding slightly as they passed through him. The phone clicked. Just once, a signal that something new had arrived. On the screen, a message had replaced the word listen. It now read, "Doors open from both sides." He stared at it for a while, then whispered the words aloud, tasting them like a prayer. Of course, all this time, he had believed the knocking came from something trying to get in, from something chasing him, calling him. But now he understood. The door had been his to open all along. The knocks were not demands. They were invitations, the echoes of everything he had locked away, coming home to rest. The closet, the phone, the voice on the other end. None of it had ever been separate. It had all been him. Trying to return, at noon the phone rang once more. This time, the screen displayed a name, unknown, recognized. He didn't hesitate. He answered. "I'm still listening," he said. The voice on the other end was not his. This time, it was soft, feminine, familiar. "You've come far," the voice said. But the line was never just yours. He blinked, startled by the sudden emotional weight that rose in his chest. "Who are you?" he asked. But even as the question left his lips, he knew the answer. "Someone who never stopped knocking," the voice replied. "Someone you kept just behind the door. Until now." It was her. Not just a thought, but her, the one he'd shut out. The one he'd let go not because he didn't love her, but because he hadn't known how to hold anything without fear of it vanishing. His throat tightened. "I thought I lost you," he said. "You did," she answered. "But not forever. You just had to find the way back." The silence that followed wasn't sad. It was reverent, forgiving, and filled with understanding. He smiled, tears building behind his eyes. "I'm here now," he said. "I know," she replied. "That's why the line stayed open." The call ended, not with a click, but with a soft tone. 4 notes, rising gently. The sound he had heard once before, long ago, when she left a voicemail he had never listened to. A message he had been too afraid to play. Until now. He sat with that tone echoing inside him, hands still resting on the receiver, heart wide open. The knocking had never been a ghost. It had been grief, not begging to be banished, but waiting to be embraced. And that is where our story ends, for now. But some doors, once opened, never truly close. If this journey through mystery, memory, and the haunting echoes of silence gripped you, there's so much more waiting beyond the next knock. We dive deep into tales that don't just keep you up at night, but make you think, feel, and listen closer. If you enjoyed this cinematic experience, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, because every week we unlock stories that explore the shadows of our past, the corners of the mind, and the echoes of forgotten truths. See you in the next story.